Well, good evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us to our second talk in the series of community landscapes, top down or bottom up. So, our first talk a couple of weeks ago was based in Sweden, and we had an informative history and analysis of 20th century public housing, looking at the arrangements, use of space, accessibility, car-free access, and increasingly now smaller green spaces, much more fragmented, more car-dominated landscapes. We also had a detailed look at Augustenborg, which was a 1930s big housing development on the outskirts of Malmö, and its refurbishment in the 1990s. And this refurbishment was driven partly by flooding problems. And one thing I thought was very interesting was that it revealed unnecessarily illogical, complex responsibilities of different authorities covering different aspects of water management. The ideas of the original landscape architect and designers were respected, and there was detailed consultation with residents, block by block. And Anne Sophie, the landscape architect who worked with Ralph Erskine at Baker, which was a fantastic link. And obviously that was where public consultation was a high priority also. So today, we're really pleased to have Helen Brown to explore public-private volunteers, charities, the changing face of landscape practice, and the implications for communities. Helen has a design background in textiles and then in landscape architecture, and she's worked in public practice on park restorations and conservation projects, including at Battersea Park, Wandsworth Lakes Project, and at Crystal Palace Park. She taught historic garden conservation and design with community at the University of Greenwich. And although now she says she's a retired member of the Landscape Institute. She remains highly active in community greening projects in southeast London. She's an officer in the newly designated Charlton Neighbourhood Forum, and she's currently working with the public and several management organisations on securing an historic landscape study for the 17th century landscapes and gardens at Charlton House. And because she looks at things differently, she's a very valued member of our FOLA committee. So I would like to hand over to Helen. Thank you.
So welcome this evening, and hello to everybody who's here on the talk. We've got the introduction on this, the private, public and private and volunteers and charities. It's been quite a research and something that I've found a lot of interesting information about. So if we could have the next page, Patience, that'd be lovely. Right. This is just a kind of collection of imagery that comes out of the kinds of organisations that I've been looking at and the things that have impacted on landscape architecture practice and what we know about in our own professional lives. And I think that what's the changes in legislation and also, community bottom-ups impacts have had a massive impact. And I don't think we've really tracked in our own minds, in our profession, actually really where that's taken us. So the next page, please. Right, the talk will investigate some of the challenges that underlie the reasons for the modification in landscape practice and delivery and how they've impacted on communities. We'll look at EU treaty obligations, planning acts, HLF, organisations in the charity sector, and the growth of community campaigns and groups, and importantly, volunteers. My personal landscape architecture practice has been in the public sector, so the focus of the talk will be there. But it's really important, everyone's watching, if they could add further insights from private, charitable, not-for-profit, and all the public sectors, if you could add your thoughts, ideas, or ask questions in the chat, that would be really, really good for the Q&A at the end. I think that I'm going to just say is the title of the talk was written weeks ago without really understanding exactly what the research would reveal. So here it goes. And a warning, there might be more questions unanswered at the end, but we might be in a better position to know what questions to ask. Next page, please. The post 1987 is really the date of the changes in the public sector. In 86-7, I started my year out at Wandsworth Council before going on to complete the landscape architecture postgraduate course. The council had a landscape office in the Parks and Leisure department with 3 really senior landscape architects and usually two-year out students. Wandsworth Parks and open spaces were managed in-house. Today, all the council's land holdings are managed from Battersea Park by Enable, an external contractor, and I don't know if there are any landscape architects now employed by the council. Generally, before 87, most work in cities, county and local authorities were in-house with directly employed workers from professional and management officers to qualified skilled staff delivering projects and services. From the Town and Country Act 1947 to the signing of the Single European Act 1987, landscape architecture has been embedded in our national, regional, local governments and public authorities, enabled by the powerful sequence of post-war planning acts, which underpinned much of the way landscape architectural practice, as with other professionals, was organised in the public sector. By the late 1970s, local authorities were beginning to consult their constituents more, but a duty to consult with the public was initially introduced in the Planning Act 2008. Planning legislation did not always pay much attention to consulting the wider communities. The history of planning and design for the post-war reconstruction of the UK was predominantly a top-down process. A key strength was the scale and universal need of reconstruction and renewal, which promoted national strategic thinking, problem solving, and the carryover from wartime organisational skills to make sure that the rebuilding of Britain was achieved. Lack of construction material supplies and labour caused many long project delays. Consultation and participation with the public was not factored into the government decision-making process. It's probably always a cultural tendency for rulers to know better than the public, increased by 6 long years of war when the public had to do what they were told. So we're mostly top-down. Next one, please. On this, we've got changes afoot, and this is where we're looking at the listings of not all the planning acts, but a lot of acts that have massive impacts on practice and delivery of landscape for the communities and new towns, on all the different acts that came in. And really there are 2 that we're going to talk about a little bit more. Firstly, the National Parks Peak District in the Scout 1951, and then the other bigger impact actually underpinning a lot of work for landscape architects, the Town and Country Act 1968. Local authorities for the first time had responsibility for structure plans and needed information on landscape quality to be able to navigate the different interests of all stakeholders. This requirement triggered the start of landscape evaluations, and the Act also had the power to allocate and purchase land, which were for the sequencing of the new towns right through to the 70s. And I'm going to go back to the landscape evaluations, which I know very little about, but it seemed that that requirement triggered quite a lot of 2, I think, main academic institutions to try to find a way of evaluating landscapes, which I don't think it was ever really resolved. And it's something I think we would be useful to look at later in another talk, maybe, is the impact of not being able to agree with planners, with all arms of landscape architectural practice, actually an agreed way to take evaluation forward. I'll leave that one there. So we're going to come to The Single European Act in 87 and 92. The directive stemming from signing the Single European Act in 87 and 92 had a very, very large impact on the way the public sector was going to be run in the future. It was an end to the public ownership of basic utilities as rail, road, transport, postal services, communications and energy and banks, an end to state aid for industry, and the introduction of compulsory competitive tendering in the public sector. This is the big one, basically. And the next one for us is the end to local government direct labour schemes. There was things about private pensions, opening public services in education and health to the private sector. But this is the key, is the UK government, unlike many mainland European governments, made the terms of the Act compulsory rather than advisory or subject to regional choices. France still owns its NFCF state railways, and they own big chunks of our rail system too, and take profits back to France. So there's obviously a very different ways of interpreting the legislation and treaties under the Single European Act. The impact of compulsive competitive tendering and outsourcing after 92 and 3 has reduced the direct employment of landscape professionals in public bodies over the last 37 years. Next slide, please. It's the first of some comments. What happened to landscape architecture in public bodies after the UK signed the Single European Act? And these are observations made for this talk, and knowing what the title was. The changes caused by the introduction of compulsory competitive tendering and contracting out. And it was seen at the beginning by council as a way of cutting expenditure. There was a general view of public sector wasteful and expensive and private sector efficient and cost effective. Looking back, this statement in some sectors does not bear too much examination. It became a race to the bottom. It was hard to argue against appointing the lowest tenderer, and you couldn't work out how they could have possibly delivered the service for that little money. My view was then, this is actually the observations of a landscape architect in the county council. I'm sorry I didn't quite make that clear. My view is then and now was that the contracts only dealt with the easily measurable elements of the work. No one was interested in the added value of having people on the ground, often with staff having detailed local knowledge and experience, plus all the other services that they provided to users. Our work became dominated by assessing service provision against contracts. There were efforts at streamlining the process, but the use of contracts that required a standard or to be achieved or retained rather than a prescribed number or an amount. The CCT era seemed to result in a whole new set of employees whose jobs were to monitor the contractors rather than delivering a practical service. Post-92, for landscape architects, in my experience, our job became more rigidly defined and constrained, with a focus on the tendering process rather than the involvement with the public who were to benefit from the service. Architects and landscape architects became surplus to requirements in local authorities, and we were gradually outsourced to private companies on 2P transfers. It was decided our services could be easily measured and outsourced, but what was lost was our understanding of the organisation's history, soft skills, and the consumer and community liaison that we could offer were not highly valued in this era of cost-cutting. It's hard to say whether the community would be better served by in-house teams of landscape architects as the world's moved on, and there are a few professional disciplines remaining. The need is often for people with a breadth of skills, including community engagement. I feel that local authorities should retain the employment of landscape architects to help identify and procure the work needed and to add value that can only be provided by people with a deep understanding of design environment, landscape, and the needs of local people. I think landscape architects are a special breed in having a deep understanding of one discipline plus a broader understanding of other areas and how it all fits together. I prefer working for local authorities as their aims still include, remarkably, the public service ethic. And that's quite a heartfelt comment on the situation as experienced by a very experienced landscape architect. Thank you. Next one. The second landscape architect who offered some comments were of quite a different angle. I worked for a district council. I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back. The importance of the public sector having advocates for green spaces and supporting community friends. I worked for a district council and then a unitary authority. Until shortly before I left, we never had our own landscape architect, although the Development Corporation used one. We used to put in the 106 agreements saying a developer would appoint a landscape architect to design and implement all green space. The cost was with the developer, and we had different designers which added to the variety. We never dealt with private-public partnerships when I was there. I managed to keep the 50-strong grounds team in-house, but within a year of me leaving, they'd contracted it out. This highlights the role of an advocate within a council that can stand up for green spaces. And I'd also personally add for landscape architecture in terms of a professional officer. Heritage lottery funding projects were a big deal for us. HLF insisted we use private sector landscape architects. We used volunteers, we set up friends groups as community involvement was an important means by which we defended our services. And you can see from the organisational logos, we've got things that were funded under many, many projects for the Heritage Fund and the Community Fund. And the Heritage Lottery Fund since 1994 has awarded £2 billion to 4,700 land, nature and biodiversity projects across the UK. And I'd like to keep that figure in mind because we're going to look at it a little bit later. And over the last 20 years, 7,000 independent local friends groups plus 70 friends forums for parks and green spaces of all kinds have been established throughout the UK. And the Parks Community Helping UK Friends Group Thrive is funded by the HLF grants plus the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. And it's part of the next stories that we're going to hear in terms of the community. Thank you. The next slide. This is the third of the comments from a landscape architect in public practice. Top down, long-term plans for bottom-up benefits. Public-private partnerships is not something I know a great deal about, primarily because the county council where I worked was a cautious, conservative, administered council that developed a healthy capital programme through the buying and selling of land, netting about 45 million a year in capital receipts. The county built up a very large rural land holding, intentionally with a view to sell on land over a long period of development when planning process permitted it. It's held on to prime conservation land, and as a result, it created 4 country parks and 5 national nature reserves, 80 sites in all for public access and conservation. This way, the public benefited from the rise in the value of land when planning consent was given. I've just got this illustration on this page simply because it's about access and how things come about. This is a national park, Pembroke Coast, easy access beaches, access for all. Other national parks who don't have coastlines have other projects called Miles Without Styles. And this really stems from the Disability Rights Act of '95, an act fought for by campaigners and volunteers. Next slide, please. So linking to the access and inclusions of people. Bottom up, the long-term impact of campaign groups on public legislation and access. In the 20th century countryside of a top-down life, there was a seminal bottom-up action, the Kinder Scout mass trespass. This was from walkers that came from the big industrial cities on either side of the Peak District, Manchester area and Sheffield. 5 people were arrested. It was a really huge, it was like a boiling pot. It boiled over. There'd been long campaigns for more access to the countryside. Anyway, this has had, down the years, 92 years, the trespass is still reverberating. And with the designation of the first national park, the Peak District, it's included Kinder Scout, and that was in 1951. And the land at Kinder Scout, Edale Village and High Peak are now owned and managed by the National Trust. The trespass it wasn't an outright win. And so during the 2020-21 pandemic shutdown, a new Right to Roam organisation took up the campaign for England. They produced a consultation draft bill based on the Land Reform Scotland Act of 2003, Part 1. Today, this is an unbelievable figure, in England, 92% of the countryside and 97% of the rivers are off limit to the public. So there's much to do. And I do recommend a look at the Right to Roam is the Right to Connect website. It's very interesting. Next slide, please. This is some of the figures that I found that I just find quite stupendous. We've got the largest charity sector in the world at a scale and reach almost unheard of overseas, over 880,000 organisations. And amazingly, the oldest continuous charity in the UK is the King's School Canterbury, established in 597 AD. We also have large numbers of the public who volunteer with registered charities, civic, learned or local community groups for practical work, specialist activities, education and training, plus fun and friendship. And this is just a very short snapshot of 3 well-established trusts that have got the figures for about volunteers and members. So the National Trust has, in 2008, 50,000 volunteers, nearly 6 million members, 500 properties, nearly 3,000 square miles of land and 780 miles of coast. Again, Wildlife Trust, a long-established charity, 39,000 volunteers, 900,000 members, and it's the 3rd largest landowner in the voluntary sector with 98,000 hectares. The Woodland Trust, more recently formed in the 70s, has got 4,000 volunteers and 500,000 members. Interestingly, it's got nearly 1,300 woods. 1,000 of them are open to the public, which is, quite an amazing feat to have achieved. The government do a community life survey, and these are the headline figures and measures from 2021. And the figures are enormous. There was 28% of respondents, approximately 28 million people in England, have volunteered in any way in the last 12 months, and 41% responding to the survey, 19 million at least once a month. And these figures are quite astounding because they're only probably a quarter of what might be being done. Obviously, this is on all volunteering, not to do with necessarily the landscape. But all volunteering contributes 18.7 billion per year to the UK economy. And 19 million people in England volunteer at least once a month. And I want to compare that contribution to the economy. The HLF funding since 1994, that's 30 years, not 1 year, 30 years, has been 2 billion. And I find those two figures really quite revealing. Next Slide, please. So we're still on the bottom up, and this is a federated organisation in 2010, National Federation of Parks and Green Spaces. It has got an amazing group of people and organisations. You can see that there's the Gardens Trust as part of it, Groundworks, Landscape Institute and Woodlands Trust, the National Trust. It goes on and on and on. I don't know whether the diagram shows a top-down version of what it really is all about. I think it probably does. So the UK Friends Groups movement, coordination, representation and services. So what's happening in the volunteer and charity volunteer and community sector is volunteering is now a growth industry, with companies offering their staff or expertise to charities, or to give placements to young people to gain experience in their industry. Charitable organisations are established solely to manage communications and activities between all the different volunteer groups, and under 16-year education now embodies volunteering as part of the curriculum activity. Younger people seem to be taking up activism for a cause or an issue they feel strongly about, rather than volunteering in a more conventional way. Much of their activism is focused on environment, equality and justice. The large numbers of volunteers look after the gardens in my borough's public parks. None would exist without their care. But for their contributions, do volunteers have any influence over the decision making? And are they really valued? Next slide. And this is really lots of questions, really. Does the government really recognise the value of volunteers, that volunteers add to British UK life? Do volunteers have any influence over decision making? And middle up, do landscape architects have any influence over decisions by government? For construction and environmental professionals, decades of outsourcing and budget cuts to public organisations has left government at a national, regional and local level with few in-house experts or advocates. Most developmental projects for social or environmental programmes are contracted out, and the pattern of a now de-skilled public authorities is reinforced. Many aspects of landscape design, planning, design and delivery, which by their very nature are decades-long programmes, have left the UK with some national key projects struggling and underfunded. It's unlikely that the UK will meet any of the goals agreed for reducing reliance on oil, climate mitigation and resilience, planning for future water supply and disposal, or housing and food production. And the other effect is fragmentation in responsibilities and delivery, with weak public governance and oversight. It's a very difficult system for the communities to have an effective input and influence over. And if it's hard for the communities, it seems equally difficult for the landscape architecture profession and others. The National Infrastructure Commission's Value of Design in Infrastructure Delivery report offers a reason for not adopting long-term economic, environmental and social value of holistically incorporating landscape-led design. This is from a report in the Landscape Journal, this winter edition. And it quotes that the NIC, that's the National Infrastructure Commission, has a deep-seated perception that good design adds costs and poses risks to delivering projects on time and on budget. And given that some of the massive overruns of costs and delays on most major government infrastructure projects in the UK, HS2, Crossrail, RAAC in school buildings, and the new hospital programme and nuclear stations, the problems seem not to be caused by good holistic design, but weak planning and governance of major projects. And I do recommend reading the article by Magdalene Kessler in the Landscape Journal. So the issue isn't just public versus private. You have to ask why the landscape architecture profession, with others, has not been compiled empirical evidence to prove the value of good holistic landscape design-led projects. Next slide. Thanks. So what next? And do we need to be activists? These are just, it's almost like having a flip chart and just taking things from the audience. What do? Do you join and support local friends or community groups to help build their expertise and influence for their local environment? Offer talks on landscape and gardens to civic and community groups? Advocate and educate on the benefits of landscape architecture in every organisation you're in contact with? Mentor and build networks of landscape champions? Learn about participatory groups, how to democratically organise self-selected individuals to work on green spaces locally. Hustle to be on the boards of heritage building, landscape, parks trusts, set up at arm's length from local or regional governments to manage buildings, open spaces, parks and gardens, and make sure landscape is represented. And what other ways can landscape architects practice? Collectives, cooperatives, not-for-profit, activist groups. Investigate the community wealth building models. So they've been initiated and run in Preston, in Lancashire, over the last 11 years. And they've got some very interesting economic models. Initiate a community group to work towards a neighbourhood forum. These are part of the Locality Act, which is 2014. And once adopted, a neighbourhood plan is a material consideration in a local plan. And the next thing is we need to be creative to find new ways of working with communities and volunteers and influencing policymakers to deliver a holistic, well-designed, landscape-led practice. And I think that might be it. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I think you've left us all a bit stunned.
I know, that's it, finished. What next? It's the what next. I mean, I think that's the point about the questions. It's just, this talk has just, for me, is sort of unearthed lots of things that seem quite they're not intractable, but there's just, why aren't we doing more? That's what I could say, really. And the contribution the volunteers make is truly amazing. And that has been an absolute eye-opener to me. I didn't realise, I mean, actually, probably most of us here are serial volunteers. I certainly am. But, I don't think you realise the value. This is the thing, people individually don't realise the value that they contribute to the quality of our lives in the UK. And as I say, it's a big discussion piece, really, rather than having any true answers.
So do you think that we just didn't notice changes happening, with legislation and the impact that had on the profession, or as a professional body, we didn't respond to it, or how did that happen?
Well, I think I'm slightly at a disadvantage, having joined the profession so late. So when I got into it, I was adult and grown up, but I wasn't experienced. I'd always worked in the private sector as a textile designer, and the harsh realities of that were, quite clear. But going into landscape architecture, and from doing my undergraduate course, I knew I really wanted to work in the public sector. And when you got into it, it was difficult to start with to even understand how that worked, and then that was, in quotes, the norm. So when the changes did come, it's sort of, you were a bit flotsam and jetsam in the system. I never had a permanent job after I can't remember, 90 something, because everything became precarious contracting, even for public sector. So you felt quite powerless. And I don't think there's ever been a response to that question about public sector. I might be wrong, but I don't think the profession has really had an answer or a position. Maybe other people might know more about that.
Please do put your comments and things. So we have one from Alison Millward. Alison, do you want to unmute and speak that out?
Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm based in Birmingham, and I've done a lot of community consultation, not least with Chris Lane and Barbara Moth, who I think are also on the participants list. But in Birmingham, where I live, we've had Birmingham Open Spaces Forum now for a number of years, one of the early urban forums. And as I speak, we think we've got something in the region of 150 different friends groups of parks in Birmingham alone. That doesn't include the Black Country. And these people have become increasingly important. My own project, I was formerly a trustee of the Chamberlain Highbury Trust, and we're trying to restore the home and estate of Joseph Chamberlain, a preeminent Victorian politician, whose house and estate sits within a wider public park, Highbury Park. And it has been, we've had really good collaboration. I've led the landscape advisory group. We worked really well with the landscape architect from Birmingham City Council, themselves a rare species. They're in a semi-private, the landscape practice group, slightly arm's length from the core, if you like, of the City Council. And we have a team of 50 garden volunteers. We have a volunteer coordinator. I raised the funds for a first phase of £300,000 as a volunteer, as a trustee of a trust, to get a first phase of works going. And it has been a joy. It's been hard, especially as we started this through COVID. But the whole collaboration of it, the open days that we've run with the public, bringing their ideas, telling us where they want the new paths, what they want to see us restored, how much of the original planting designs we should go for, how we balance that with the biodiversity that has just blossomed in the park, largely in part through neglect. And then a rather petulant sort of natural spring problem that we have because of our geology, which creates wetlands where we don't expect them to be created. But that collaboration between those different groups of people has changed that landscape. You know, that the first phase of work, 300,000. We've just had a round 2 approval of 4.8 million for the house and the from Heritage Fund that has to be matched by our bankrupt City Council at some point in the future. Both house and garden are listed, and they are duty bound to make some investment. But it's a really positive experience to work with landscape architects, people who can manage contractors, appoint contractors, who will then work in a complementary way with the volunteers, with the trustees, with very knowledgeable people. We have a garden historian, Philip Ballard, on our trustees. She has just got deep knowledge of historic parks and gardens. And it is a joy, but it's hard.
Philida was on our committee, so we know her well.
Yeah, well, she turned 80 a few weeks ago.
Oh,
and
wow. Gosh.
We need to download her somehow or other because so much is in her head.
Yes.
And so if you can support me, if you ever see her, and just encourage her to think about that.
Absolutely. Gosh.
It sounds like a really large-scale project. And thank you very much for all your very admiring words and compliments to landscape architects. But it is one of our strengths, I think, that is very underestimated in terms of how just that contact with communities and learning how to. I was on Crystal Palace Park for 2 years, and the people and the vested interests and the communities that use a big park like that they're just a mine, the mine of information, and they are the people that you need to go to and marry that experience up with, as you say, having a historian and an expert that can give you the other parts of the story. And the layering of landscapes is just an amazing thing to do, and looking at that, the past, the future, and the people now and what they're looking for in a landscape. But funding, and not having someone in a kind of public role with public funding for their salaries I think it's a very big ask of our governments to rely always it being in this way. And I don't really know, this is the questions I keep asking myself, is how do we get the agenda changed to provide more support for people like yourselves in projects like that? I mean, a local authority would find it hard to run. I mean, a well-financed local authority, say 30 years ago, would find that to be a major project to progress.
Yeah, and we've been blessed with some very enthusiastic people who love the story of the place, and go above and beyond their, technically speaking, their job spec. Our constituency park manager actually works over on the complete opposite side of the city, but he used to work on our side, and he knows Highbury well.
Yeah.
And so he continues to keep an arm around us and do what he can to help when we need his help.
Yeah.
But we have, and I'm sure this is reflected in other places. I wish somebody was here from the parks forums, because in our park we have the Birmingham and District Beekeepers Association. They do all their training from the apiary in the park. We have something called the Fruit and Nut Village locally, and they've been cloning the apples and pears trees from the original Victorian pergola in the kitchen garden, and those have been created into a new orchard. We've got the Friends group who run the archaeological walks and actually have done the local sites assessment for the ecological value. Our local ecologist did that in a voluntary capacity. So when you get a group of talent together, be they paid or unpaid, passionate, or just find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, to get involved, it's amazing, absolutely amazing what can be achieved, by sharing the work of bringing about the change. But we honestly, Helen, we couldn't have done what we've achieved so far without the skills of the landscape architect, and particularly the contract management skills. I know you were sort of saying, your role changed from design into tender specs and contract management. But that is something that would be really hard for volunteers to do unless they've got a background.
No, and in fact, it's what I tend to end up slightly, giving local groups that do things. I think there's a picture on the last slide of a corner garden in a plot between two tall housing blocks, and it was just a waste ground, and it was fraught with difficulties because they hadn't got a landscape architect on the team, and there wasn't one in the borough, and things didn't quite go to plan, So I came in. I met through a kind of sequence of people. I wasn't directly involved in the project, but I was able to help out with letters that sounded businesslike and things about contract specifications and things like that. Because if you've not, it's a very specialist area, and that's, it's nice to hear that you've got that kind of support. Actually, that first description that I talked about the county council wasn't me. It was just, it was written in the first person. And the three experiences of landscape architects in public practice were from three other landscape architects. I think that what's wonderful about it is this wonderful enthusiasm. But I was going to ask you one question was, what's the average age, do you think, of your, other than Philadelphia, what's the average age of your volunteers?
Well, that's interesting because we also have a youth board, and I can remember them challenging me about, can we include an anaerobic digester in the orchard at some point, which kind of came out of left field and made me think. We do have a compost toilet in the orchard, I have to say now, which every time I go in the park, I'll look to make sure it's still there and hasn't been torched. So we do range. The volunteers who do the rhododendron and the laurel bashing vary from, I would say, somebody looking for, to use their 5th day in their working week to do something a bit different in their 30s, up to people like me in their 60s. We've got, in the orchard, we do a lot of work with vulnerable groups. So we've got sort of mental health programs, and the volunteers there, they're probably, the people who lead those sessions are probably in their 30s. So it's quite wide ranging.
It sounds like a wonderful project.
Beekeepers are as well. So yeah, I don't think we and because of the background, the context of Joseph Chamberlain, who really set up good civic governance in Birmingham, we have to walk the talk. So we churn our trustees and we make sure that new skills come in and the skills auditing, and we assess what we need going forward. This is particularly with the Chamberlain Library Trust, because it's really important, and that youth board is really important to us as well. So we work hard at that, in actual fact.
It sounds like you've got a really good organisational setup, because actually that's the problem. I've looked up stuff on certainly things like heritage trusts and people like that have been set up by local authorities. And many of the boards don't really have, I don't think, the skill levels needed. And people tend to be there because of being appointed because of, I don't know, civic and other claims to fame, but they're not necessarily always the right people. And I do think that's one of the things that I think we do need to do as a profession, is to make sure that landscape is on the, is represented if possible. And I think that's a very important thing. Can I have another question, Alison? Have you written up about is there anywhere I could look at your project online? Do you have a...
the website is Chamberlain Highbury Trust.
One.
And if you go into the resources section, it will take you from the original landscape appraisal, which was done back in 2010. And then you can access videos and additional reports and that kind of thing of what we've done. We've got a brilliant activity planner, Lucy, who just keeps creating all kinds of ways and means of bringing different people into the park. We've had a sustainability festival. We've done this, that, and the other. She's great, and it is a really lovely fusion. I mean, Helen, we've even got a huge collection. We've got 36 different varieties of rhododendrons, and everybody takes a sharp intake of breath and think, you know, rhododendrons. But these were partly cultivated by Joseph Chamberlain. He had 16, I think it's 14 or 16 glass houses. Well, we've only gone and taken DNA material from the original rhododendrons, and they're growing along now in petri dishes in a laboratory in Cornwall. So we're using sort of modern day techniques to replicate the living collection, to give it new heart and to sustain it going forward. So there's all sorts of really interesting offshoot little mini projects, you know, that are on the go as well. It's been terrifying, but very rewarding to have gone as far as we have with this project.
Well, congratulations. It's really good to hear how well you've done. And I'm certainly going to have a look and be in touch, because it's just the sort of thing, the pattern and the ideas might be really useful for a lot of local groups that have got historic, elements of their sites have got historic landscape or historic buildings, or historic walls that are listed. And it sounds like you've really got a good handle on how to push a project forward.
Yeah, please come and see us.
I will, I will.
Sounds fantastic, Alison. Can I ask a quick question? And that is, how do you stop a group of volunteers packing up when the leader goes, or when the key person? How do you keep that structure and motivation and things going that isn't dependent on individual people, which it must be to a certain extent? Sorry, it's a rather rambly question.
Yeah, I mean, I favour some hard work at succession planning. So a year before, someone theoretically should step down. Let's say they've done 2 terms of 3 years each or something of that, as I did. Then I took on the responsibility for finding my replacement. It takes about a year to do that, and to invite somebody along to join a group and to see how it works, and to persuade them that their skill set is what is needed going forward. We all have certain skill sets, and they're useful at a certain time in a project, and then you need other skill sets to come in and do that. Now, we've been successful at succession planning within the trust. The Friends struggle, but they do all right in the end. They bring new people in, and IT has been a marvellous reason for bringing new blood onto committees, because everybody's needed help with their websites and their Zoom meetings and this, that and the other. So that's been a great help as well. But I don't think, people like me who are now connected to a place with an umbilical cord, even though we've stepped down from being a trustee, we're never going to go away. No. And we're always going to be there, like Phillida is. She's there till she's had special dispensation, Annabelle, to as a trustee for a third. You can imagine, can't you, for a third term? But I've got no idea what we do without her. So we do have honorary people in the group, as it were, that we can always call on. So, but succession planning is really important, and none of us are indispensable. It's sure. You have to remember that you come along, you do a job, and then you've had that responsibility. It may have worked, it may not have worked, but it's always good to hand that responsibility over. Nobody has to do it for a lifetime.
No.
My view is do it for 3 years or 4 years, but then step down, take a breath, recharge your batteries, and then you can come back with renewed energy if it's appropriate to do so.
Sounds like good advice. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Helen, I don't know if you are within audible connections, but you've raised a point that I think would be good to air. Can we do that?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
I think, having worked in a local authority for many years, I learnt very slowly, the hard way, how the democratic process works, and it's important that you put the case for why we should support parks, open spaces, landscape, green space, whatever we want to call it. And within that, the role of Friends Group is really important, because basically all the people in Friends Groups vote in the next elections for the local councillors. And so the local councillors want to keep the Friends Groups happy, and that's the principle and underlying why it works so well. So I think you need paid staff and volunteers together to actually defend some of these really important services. And I think the other point to make is that local knowledge is very important, because you can contract something out to a company that maybe is based, miles away, and they have to come in and find out all the day-to-day things that someone working there knows already. You don't have to, you end up paying people twice because they come in trying to find all the local knowledge. So, and I mean, we've seen on the news today about the South Somerset closing down one of their sports facilities, and quite an outcry from local residents. That's what people have to do to keep these services at the moment, I think.
But parks aren't a statutory undertaking. I mean, that's a gross weakness, isn't it, or failure in the system?
Yes, it is, but libraries are a statutory undertaking, and they've still cut libraries. Because I think the two services that local authorities deliver that give them good news in the local paper are parks and open spaces and libraries. And because a lot of the other things are things you don't really want to do. I mean, refuse collection is sort of necessary function. It's not exciting in any way. A lot of the social services problems are when things go wrong. So parks and libraries are the two things that get positive press coverage, positive democratic things, and I think it's sort of learning how to play that system. So libraries are statutory, but they've still cut a lot of libraries. So it would help if parks were statutory, but I don't think it totally solves the problem.
I'm just going to say that I mean, the political issues for local authorities at the moment has been a 40% cut in their budgets.
Yeah,
that's been a very devastating impact on how they can operate. And then I think changes to the way they collect council tax, receipts from right to buy, everything is stacked against councils, local authorities actually functioning properly for their populace. There's no two ways about that.
And I think one of the counter arguments is they end up spending a great deal of money on a small number of people, such as special needs cases and elderly in homes, and that much as that is an absolutely valid thing to do, if it takes all the money from everyone else, I think that's really quite a political issue.
I think we could argue it in slightly different ways. The fact that the allowances for people, as in special needs, has actually been cut by the government. I mean, I think the problem is just the total. Over the last years of austerity and the reduction in government funding to public authorities is actually causing it. You can see by the reliance in the growth of volunteer sector is that the volunteers are in many, many areas, I think, of what wouldn't have been considered, would have been more considered to be a government provided service. I think we know that there's a problem with funding. I think the thing is that we need to try to make the most of what we've got and actually really agitate for the benefits of having beautiful, wonderful landscapes in all our country, all over our country, have got massive benefits, and they can be personal to the economic, and we need to get it on the agenda more, I think. That's it.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult because there's been a lot of research done showing how important these spaces are. The bottom line is, if the local authorities run out of money, what do they do?
Yes, exactly.
So, not easy.
So is there anybody in our audience who can talk about landscape evaluation and the funding of, or how that could be better used, or if it is available and I don't know about it. No, okay.
I think it's something we need to look into.
Yes.
Excuse me.
So, Helen, what do you think? What should the next step be then, in sort of like pulling all these bits of threads of ideas out, and how to move on with this?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think that the way that we practice landscape architecture is quite. It tends to be kind of in silos. It's in public authority. Some of it, a little bit, is in public authorities and in private practice, which tends to be quite conventional business organisations. And I tried to find out whether there was any collectives or cooperative practices, design practices. And I on the search that I've done, I just can't find anything. And in some ways, it's like that you could. I think guerrilla landscape architecture is not quite the right word, but it's the kind of idea of coming together as landscape architects to do something. It's a little bit more, not fluid. I can't think of the word. It's actually having a different outlook on the structures of how landscape architects come together and work. And it could be that being something that's quite very innovative, not necessarily long term, but would give us a kind of range of kinds of people that can come together. Maybe it's really like, I mean, I'm retired and I know I'm active, but I'm retired, but, maybe young people, if you once you've graduated and you're ready to go, having lots of ideas about how you might practice, and it might be very different to how we see conventional landscape architecture practice at the moment. And I just think the funding for volunteers and the appreciation of them is just not there, and I find it quite shocking, actually, that.
So it's not there. From whom do you want it?
Well, I think a lot of it's got to come from government. I think there's no two ways about it. I mean, philanthropic stuff is already huge. I'm not sure. I'm not an economic person, but as I say, if you look at the community wealth building model that's in Preston City, it's got there's quite a lot of writing about it, and also actually University of Greenwich economics department have got a lot of discussion about how economic modelling of actually investing. You invest to create work. It's the kind. Is it the donut for that donut thing where it's around?
Oh, yes. Yes.
All this stuff. I think
Kate Haworth. Yes.
That's the thing about our models of economic activity. Don't really recognise. I mean, because everything's based on GDP, of course, but they don't recognise those soft skills, those other things, and the quality. So it does. I mean, that's a very big political argument, but I can't see why we don't have collectives. Can't see why we don't have cooperative organisations. I don't know, and I don't know a lot myself about private practice, so I don't know whether anybody here has got any ideas about how we can open it all up and be more influential. I think that's really important. I was in a public, not public meeting. I was in our Green Greenwich environmental networking, an early meeting, and there was about 30 people in the room, and I was introduced, and obviously I was introduced as a landscape architect, and then somebody else was in the room with a landscape architect, and that was like stunning. In a public meeting, to be in a room with another landscape architect. This is in a part of London that's got a university that's got a landscape architecture course, and I still thought it was wonderful. He was a student, and I've kept in touch because you just don't come across us very often in the general world. And actually, this is a little aside, that there's actually a skills shortage in landscape architecture, which I was amazed about. But I think that's a lot to do with student financing, and the kind of drop off in take up of higher education is quite significant across the board, not just in landscape architecture. But no, it was really a delight to meet them. Another landscape architect. So we don't get around a lot, and there's not a lot of us. So I think there's a lot to do for when you do actually qualify. I don't think we realise I think social responsibility is not the right word, but I do think I feel it's a vocation in the sense of what you do, and that's what I like to bring. That's what I feel like. Well, not like, I must do it. I must bring it. And I don't know whether it's something that we encourage our younger student and young landscape architects to feel that way. I'm sure they do. I don't mean this to be derogatory at all, but life is very busy if you're younger. You're working long hours. You've probably got family. Things aren't quite the same as if you're retired, and and don't have quite so many worries. So you can give your time more, but we need to try and find ways to be able to support people to do more. And I think that might be one of the things that we could have to think about.
Because I suppose within our profession, there's a sort of like a belt in the middle, age-wise, of people not being able to do anything because either they're worked so hard and have young families and all the financial burdens and all the rest of it, which then sort of knocks them out of doing anything more than nose down and getting on with life.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it is difficult, but then all these wonderful people that volunteer probably in a similar boat. There's I just think there's not a network yet, maybe, of understanding about, not a network, there's not an understanding about this aspect, and the reliance we have on the charity and volunteer sector. As I said, two of my local parks just would not have a flowering, beautiful small gardens within the parks. They wouldn't exist without the friends groups, not at all. And and people give up a lot of time to actually keep the gardens looking beautiful. They really do. And they propagate plants, and they really are very active. And I don't think, actually, it's not me. I know that they're doing it, but I'm not sure whether the public really realise how much of our gardens, in particular, our public gardens, are looked after by volunteers. It's a hidden kind of massive benefit, isn't it?
Absolutely. So more publicity.
I think so. I think it might be, and just the fact that I wasn't aware of the economic contribution that the voluntary sector made to our economy. It's huge, certainly huge. But it's just more to be looked at, I think. And actually, I mean, this talk was extremely exploratory, and it's really just the start of having a good poke around in this topic area and looking at what's going on.
So Alison's included a reference to the MP's inquiry into children, young people and the built environment this morning, and the impact it's had on MPs, which is rather shocking in itself that they were shocked at how poor access impacts on physical and mental health throughout the life and development. We need to agitate more, she says.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I think there will be other people who are still taking in what you've said this evening, Helen, and I think we've got to come back to this and I don't know, maybe have it as a roundtable discussion or as a real in touch person debate and things, and tease it out more.
Well, just if could make a call now to the people that have been on it to have a chat into to you and to Fola
to info at Fola.
Mulling it over, and if anything crops up that you'd like to let us know about, that would be really wonderful.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can drop it really, because it's so important. This is the issue. It's so important. And it's interesting, and we need to make landscape architecture more powerful. Basically.
So our email is info@fola.uk. Very simple. So please do shout.
Okay.
Or not shout. But in the meantime, Helen, I think I'm going to wind it up now. But I think that's been fantastic, and I particularly like to thank you for all the work and the pulling out the hair and all that to get to this point. I'm really grateful, and I think you've produced something which is great, which is helpful and a good kick, actually, to get us thinking about all this differently.
Thank you. It's been very enjoyable to a degree. No, it's been enjoyable. Always good to learn things anyway. But I do think, there's a lot to be done, and it'll be good to make contacts with people that are interested in this, and we can take it on and see where it goes.
Thank you very much, and Patience, thank you very much for hosting, Patience and the Gardens Trust for hosting this event, and we look forward to next week, which is Jan on oh God, I've forgotten it. Sorry. Oh, I'm so hopeless. Hang on a minute. On Robert Marnock. So please come 6 o'clock next week and listen to the collective landscapes of Robert Marnock in London. Thank you very much indeed.